We start the meeting. I have a brief introduction to read, and then we'll introduce the members of the board and the city staff that are here with us tonight. The Board of Zoning Appeals is a group of 7 of your neighbors or peers appointed by City Council to pass judgment on requests for variances and other matters that are brought before them. A variance is a relaxation of the literal provisions of the zoning ordinance. Petitioners must indicate a hardship or practical difficulty running with the land that would warrant the granting of the variance. The board will hear the items in the order that they appear on the agenda. When an item is called, the chairman will verify that the petitioner is present. Then the city administration will summarize the facts of the case. Petitioner will then be given an opportunity to address the board to explain the justification for the action requested. After the petitioner makes their presentation and answers any questions that the board may have, the chairman will open the public hearing. Any person wishing to speak on the request should raise their hand, and when recognized by the chairman, come up to the podium, sign in on the sheet provided. The speaker should identify themselves with their name, address, and indicate their relationship to the property in question, for example, a next-door neighbor, and state whether they are in favor of or against the variance request and give reasons for their opinion. Comments must be directed through the chairman. Comments should be kept as brief as possible and closely pertain to the matter under consideration. Only one person will be recognized by the chairman to speak at one time. At the conclusion of public comments, the chairman will close the public hearing. Once the public hearing is closed, no other public comment will be taken unless in response to a specific question by a member of the board. The board will then make a motion to approve, deny, or table action on the request. In order for the request to pass, a minimum of 4 votes for approval are needed. If the request is not granted, the applicant has the right to appeal the board's decision to the Oakland County Circuit Court. And with us tonight, we have on my far left, your right, is Member Glenn Clark. Next to him is Bruce Bloomingdale, who is an alternate member of the board, and he's sitting in place of Mr. Bartnick tonight, who is absent. Next is Thomas Stratt, who not only serves on the Zoning Board of Appeals, but also is our liaison from the Planning Commission. Next to him is myself, Dave Lambert, the chairman. Next to me is our illustrious vice chairman, Alan Neal. Next to Alan is Bill Fisher, and last but certainly not least member of the board is Ken Courtney. From city staff, we have Paul Evans, who is a zoning and compliance specialist for the city, and our assistant city attorney, Susan Lancaster. And also here in the audience with us tonight is our other alternate member, Orestes Kaltsounis. With that, Mr. Evans, would you call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bloomingdale.
Here.
Mr. Clark?
Here.
Mr. Courtney?
Here.
Mr. Fisher?
Here.
Mr. Neal?
Here.
Mr. Lambert?
Here.
Mr. Stratt?
Here. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Evans. Next is the approval of the minutes from the April meeting. Is there a motion to approve those minutes or any questions? Mr. Clark.
I moved approval of the minutes as presented.
I'll second.
Seconded by Mr. Stratt. Any questions or amendments on the minutes? Seeing none, we're ready for the roll call and approval of the minutes.
Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mr. Courtney?
Yes.
Mr. Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Neal?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Stratt?
Yes.
Mr. Bloomingdale?
Yes.
The minutes from the April meeting are approved as written. Next is the approval of the agenda. Are there any changes that need to be made to tonight's agenda? Seeing none, we will move into the hearing of cases. The first and only one for tonight is a variance request from Gary Abathera at 1135 Chopin. I was never sure with that if it's Chopin or Chopin, if it's Troy pronunciation or the correct Polish pronunciation or not, but it's a property between 1125 and 1143 Chopin, and it's in order to continue construction on a new house, a variance from the requirement that the house be set back at least 10 feet from one side lot line and have a combined total setbacks for both side yards of at least 20 feet. The applicant is requesting the proposed house be 9 feet from one property line and 6 feet from another. Before I turn it over to Mr. Evans to present the case, Mr. Bloomingdale wanted to apprise us of a situation to make sure the board doesn't have any issues.
Yes, I think it's important to let the board know that I know Mr. Abathera. His son and my grandson play on a couple teams together, so we've talked over the years.
Any concerns by board members over that relationship?
You have a financial interest?
No.
That answers the question.
Okay. Sounds like the board and city staff have no concerns about a possible conflict of interest. So with that, Mr. Evans, you can present the case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subject property is on the north side of Chopin in a residentially zoned neighborhood which is east of Rochester Road and north of East Maple. More specifically, it's located between 1125 and 1143. This particular map shows it as being 1131 Chopin. That address is now gone, and the house that was there has been removed. The official address now is 1135 Chopin. The property and all surrounding property in the yellow is zoned for single and two-family housing. In March of this year, the city issued a building permit for a new home on the property. It's a two-story home, as indicated in these plans from the building permit that was issued. The ordinance for this zone requires a minimum of a 10-foot side yard setback for each side of the subject property. Now, the permit that was issued called for setbacks, or allowed setbacks rather, of 6 feet on the east side and 9 feet on the west side. So that's under what the ordinance allows. The building department realized the error and asked the applicant to discontinue building the house until this matter could be brought to the Board of Appeals for potential variance action. The photo that you see here now is the extent of the construction at the time the city discovered the error that they had made, and now the applicant requests a variance so he can continue construction on the house.
Any questions for Mr. Evans from the board members? Seeing none, we will call up the petitioner, Mr. Abathira, to present his information and answer any questions from board members or city staff. And be sure to sign in on the little sheet there.
Good evening. My name is Gary Abathira. I'm the builder of the house. And as Mr. Evans said, I applied for the building permit, started the construction, and was notified before we started the framing that the zoning change in that area has changed in the last 6 months to a year. And they used to allow, there was an excerpt in the zoning that allowed R1E zoning in that two-family multi-area. And nobody realized that it was taken out until we were this far along. I've talked to Brent up in planning, and he was going to get it back to the planning commission to see if it's something they want to change. But in the meantime, I'm where I'm at right now. I'm here to answer any questions anybody has.
Questions from members of the board?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Stratt.
Yeah, is this your home or is this a spec home?
It's a spec home.
See?
I've built numerous homes in the area in the last 10 to 15 years under the old zoning ordinance, 60-foot lots with R1E zoning of 5 and 10. And I like to keep them 6 and 9 so that we don't encroach on the 5 and 10. Another thing just to mention, in the area, there are 40-foot lots too. And I built the two houses on a 40-foot lot, which the city allows if it's a lot of record. And there you have your 5 and 10, you'd have a 25-foot wide house. If you go 10 and 10, you're going to come for a variance because the city doesn't allow a house under 24 feet wide. So it's kind of a gray area in that whole area in there.
Any other questions from board members? Yes, Mr. Courtney.
Yeah, have you discussed this with the residents on either side?
I did not.
No.
I've talked.
I know they've gotten notice and they evidently haven't answered us, so they must not be objecting. But
the people on the east side, I talked to all the time. I never mentioned about the zoning because they were so happy to see the old house torn down and the yard cleaned up and the trees removed and a new house being built in the area to raise the value in there.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Bloom.
The house that you're building, is it consistent with the other houses in that area?
Yes. In fact, if you look at that picture across the street, it looks just like that one there.
Gotcha. Okay.
And the houses to the east, there's 3 new ones there in the last 10, 12 years that look just like that.
Yes, Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe you've been before our board quite a few times. As you mentioned, you've been building that area. I think that triangle, is I think they call it there, that's an area that you've done a lot of business in as far as building and so forth. I used to live right across the road from there, so I'm very familiar with that neighborhood. I guess, you know, I think the biggest complaint in the past via neighbors who lived there were a lot of homes that weren't cared for. And it seems like you've been a part of the renaissance of that neighborhood over the many years. And I can ask this of you, because you've built, but you mentioned something about the different setbacks based on the different zoning. Maybe Mr. Evans can address that. I'd just be curious, off the top of your head, and maybe then Mr. Evans could address it, how many different variations are there in that particular area as far as setbacks?
The setbacks.
Footage, you know,
Yeah.
different footage.
On the 60-foot lots, they've always been 5 and 10, 25 and 35. And the front and rear setbacks in the area is consistent. The difference you get into is the 5 and 10, or if you go 10 and 10, then your house is only 40 feet wide. Very difficult to put a two-car garage in and still give the things that the people want to buy a house. It's amazing that 5 feet makes that much of a difference. That's, you know, the southern end of the city is a lot of R1E zoning, which if you drive up and down a lot of those areas, they're in that same zoning. And the houses, it looks nice.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answered your question.
Helped.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Stratt.
I guess I think that this construction of this new house is going to improve the conditions and the values of the adjacent homes. However, I do have I don't know exactly, and I guess it should be actually addressed by staff. Under what section of the ordinance can we actually grant this approval? Under what area? It's certainly not an exception to the narrowness of the lot. You know, the things that I read that we should use, what criteria can we use? Is there any one?
Well, certainly there's no indication at all that this was caused in any way, shape, or form by the builder. He made a good faith application to the building department. The building department, after some time, after the permit was issued and actual substantial construction occurred on the property, did they realize the oversight and, you know, placed a stop work order on it. Really, I'm not sure that was necessary. He's a very cooperative builder, and he would have stopped no matter what. I would have to say one of the things that the board might want to focus on in their discussion was that this was something that was out of the control of the builder. I know that the person who did review the plans certainly has a great track record of making the right decision. This was a mere oversight. They're not happy about it, but at the same time, I don't see any indication that the builder came in, and he's built a number of homes in this area where the zoning was allowed 5 on one side and 10 combined, that there was any intent to mislead the city. I think it was just an oversight on everybody's part, and they're just trying to make it right. Otherwise, staff, we don't know whether to call it it's not really a nonconformity. It doesn't have a variance. Is it illegal? That's kind of a hanging legal question that I think can get wrapped up potentially with board action tonight.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I could also add that this is a neighborhood that I think you've all mentioned. It's on the record that this area was developed when the lots were a lot smaller. Historically, this has kind of been the way it's developed, and due to the pattern of people needing larger houses and bigger footprints, I think that goes to the aesthetics of the neighborhood. It doesn't appear that any of the neighbors feel that it's going to jeopardize the neighborhood, and when you look at the totality, along with the fact that the plot plan got approved with based upon the cities, if you take all of that together, I think you meet your hardship criteria. Just the things that have been said tonight, plus what Paul has said. And
Does that answer your question, Mr. Stratt?
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Neal.
I do have two questions. and sir, you may be able to answer this, and maybe I missed it, I apologize. In looking, what brought up the first question is, on the last page of the submittal that we have, which is sheet 18, which is really an internal email explaining matter of events. On the 26th, it sounds like of March, you had approval. And it looks like on the 30th, if I'm reading this right, is when I think our staff realized the error. When was it communicated to you? Do you know the date, roughly?
No, I don't. I just know that I had the basement foundations and the walls going in.
Okay. I just want to make sure is that once you got approval, did you actually move that quick? Like 4 days? Or?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
That was when it was hot, wasn't it?
I excavate and do my own
Yeah.
basement walls, and
I understand.
we're like everybody else. We're not busy right now, so.
The reason I asked, I was just wondering is that, did the installation of the foundation occur like in April? And I was trying to make sure I understood all the dates, but you answered my question just fine.
Okay.
You just moved quickly. You got approval, you moved quickly, okay. The question I have for staff is, under the review standards in section 15.04 D, where it says the characteristics which make compliance with dimensional requirements difficult must not have been created by the current or previous owner. The current owner is the applicant, previous owner of course doesn't apply. The demands that he has to work under aren't his creation, they're really ours as a municipality. Does that component right there, and maybe this question is for both of you actually, but does that component right there, if we base our decision on letter D, work, the language in it? It seems like to me it does, but I'd like your opinion. That's just,
Chair?
Yes.
Definitely, I guess another way I could say this is if the board chose to deny this and there was a subsequent lawsuit, it would make a big difference to a judge that we approved it and he put the basement in before he, if that's helpful to the question that was asked. Certainly, it happens, doesn't happen often in Troy, but every once in a while something gets approved that, sometimes it's caught before any work is done. In this case, the basement went in before it was caught.
Any other questions for Mr. Abathiro? Okay, seeing none, you can have a seat. We may call you back, I don't know, so. Okay, any more questions from the board for staff on this issue? I just have one, and maybe it's more to come up after this case is dealt with, but having driven through that neighborhood, I'm wondering, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Stratt as well as the Planning Commission, whether these setbacks in that neighborhood need to be reviewed by staff or the Planning Commission. I guess Mr. Evans, the first shot at that.
Well, I can say that I've had internal discussions with the planning director, and we both don't see any reason why they can't go back to where they were for single-family homes. No less than 5 on one side, and a total of 15 for both combined totals. As indicated here tonight, a substantial amount of new development in that area was put in under that old standard, and at least administratively, it's unclear to us that we can find any negative towards doing that. And of course, ultimately, it'll be the recommendation of the Planning Commission, action by council.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Stratt, did you have any follow-up on that? Or?
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that we've got a lot of non-conforming going on because of this, and certainly I think we should look at that on a planning level as well as your comments. I think are well taken, because certainly we want to improve the area. We're not trying to destroy the area. And what he's trying to do is, I'm sure that all of us are trying to help him as much as we can, legally and otherwise. Right now, that's all we're having, our problem sites. As we all know, we're going to have a lot of variances coming up.
All right, any more questions from the board, or does somebody want to propose a resolution?
Well, I'd like to just make one comment.
Sure.
Based on what I'm observing here, and I have to apologize, I didn't go by, but The 6-foot area, it appears that it's adjacent to the garage area, the neighbor to the east. And then to the west, there seems to be a 26-foot distance between that single-family home. I can't see where there's any real damage done. If nothing else, I think it's a vast improvement to the entire neighborhood. So with that comment, I just wanted to let everybody know what my feelings are anyway.
Any further questions, or someone want to offer a resolution? All right, well, I will move that we approve the variance based upon the evidence presented by Mr. Abathira and by the questions from the board and the responses by staff. So I would make that motion and ask for a second. Mr. Stratt seconds it. Any discussion on the motion to grant the variance? Seeing none, I guess we're ready for the roll call.
Mr. Courtney?
Yes.
Mr. Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Neal?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Stratt?
Yes.
Mr. Bloomingdale?
Yes.
Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Motion passes. You have your variance. Thank you. Okay. I should have mentioned also for the record, I didn't open the public hearing, but there was nobody here for the public hearing anyway, so unless Mr. Kalsunis wanted to say something, I should mention that we did have one letter in support of, or it looks like an email in support of the variance request too, so we're going to make sure that's part of the record as well. Next on the agenda is communications. I don't know if we have any communications from either staff or any member of the board here. Seeing none, we're going to go on to miscellaneous business, which is the annual elections for chair and the vice chair. And it says here both are for one-year terms.
Mr. Chairman,
Courtney.
I'd like to make a motion that we elect Mr. Neal for chairman and Mr. Clark for vice chairman for the ensuing year.
Okay. Before I ask for a second, I want to double check because this was a controversial issue last year. Check with staff to make sure this is particular formatting of the motion is not in violation of our rules. I don't believe it is because
It isn't. I checked
Okay,
the
so-
rules.
I don't think it's...
We'll take Mr. Courtney's word on that.
I did check the rules.
Right, and always someone can bifurcate if you don't want to vote together, but if there's a second and there's no bifurcation after that, you can vote on the slate, so to speak.
All right. Mr. Stratt, yes, you have a
Yeah, I would like to entertain also Mr. Bartnick if he would be available for chair. Since he was, I did receive a message from him, an email, that he would accept that position even though he's not here. And I know that we had discussions last year at this time with Mr. Bartnick, but I felt that I would agree and I would make the motion or a recommendation that he be chair as well.
Okay. In the, so we have, yes, Mr. Clark.
I would like to second Mr. Courtney's motion, and I don't understand, maybe the attorney can deal with the competing motions. I guess we'd have to perhaps, under point of order, see if there's a second for Mr. Stratt's motion, but then I just wanted to make sure that the main motion was dealt with first.
I believe if Mr. Clark has seconded the motion, the appropriate point at this part would be if somebody wanted to offer another name, they would move to bifurcate the motion.
And offer a substitute motion.
Okay. So if Mr.
And I would second
All
Mr.
right.
Press.
So it sounds like Mr. Stratt is moving to bifurcate and do a substitute motion so that we would elect the chairman and vice chairman separately. Is that correct, Mrs. Lancaster?
That's correct.
Okay.
And
So now the motion would be to bifurcate the resolution that was made by Mr. Courtney and seconded by Mr. Clark, which would split this up, and this would be a substitute motion. So any discussion on that motion by Mr. Stratt? Seeing none, have a roll call on bifurcating, which is to split this apart, and a substitute motion.
Mr. Neal?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes?
Mr. Stratt?
Yes.
Mr. Bloomingdale?
Yes.
Mr. Clark?
No.
Mr. Courtney?
No.
Mr. Fisher?
Yes.
So the motion is passed, and then at this point, I believe then we would take names of nominees for so we already have, it sounds like Mr. Neal has been nominated for chairman, and Mr. Bartnick has been nominated for chairman as well. Any further nominations for the office of chairman? Seeing none, then I guess we would have a roll call for choose either Bartnick or Neal.
Right. Mr. Lambert,
Neal.
Mr. Stratt,
Bartnick.
Mr. Bloomingdale,
Bartnick.
Mr. Clark,
Mr. Neal.
Mr. Courtney,
Neal.
Mr. Fisher,
Bartnick.
Mr. Neal.
Mr. Neal.
Okay, Mr. Neal has 1, 2, 3, 4. So Mr. Neal is 4-3.
Congratulations, Mr. Neal, on your election.
Congratulations.
The next would be vice chairman. It sounds like Mr. Clark's name has been offered as vice chairman. Is that still your intent, Mr. Courtney?
Yes.
Okay, any other nominations for vice chairman? Seeing no other nominations for vice chairman, I would assume we could just vote. The motion has been made and seconded, so I guess just do a roll call for Mr. Clark, make it
Right.
as easy as possible.
Mr. Stratt,
Yes.
Mr. Bloomingdale,
Yes.
Mr. Clark,
Yes.
Mr. Courtney,
Yes.
Mr. Fisher,
Yes.
Mr. Neal,
Yes.
Mr. Lambert.
Yes. Congratulations, Mr.
Congratulations.
Clark. And that concludes the miscellaneous businesses on the agenda. I assume there's no other new business or miscellaneous business?
I had a thought, and I just
Sure.
wanted to throw this out for the board if I could, Mr. Chair. The Planning Commission recently changed their meeting times to 7 o'clock, I believe, or they're going to. The Animal Control Appeals Board, they meet at 7 o'clock. Maybe we don't have to have an answer tonight, but perhaps if that's something the board might want to consider moving their meeting time up, if that was amenable to everybody, we could simply amend our rules of procedure. But I'll throw that out there, and perhaps I'll ask the question again next month, unless, of course, the board wants to just talk about it now. But I figured I'd just throw that out.
Okay. Anyone wish to give any input on moving to 7 o'clock for a meeting time? Or do you want to think about it, Mr. Clark?
I've kind of wondered why that time came over the years. I think it just replicated what city council did. I would just say that earlier, the better, especially when you've had some of the packed agendas that we've had of recent day. And I remember I think that we have just about 6 or 8 months ago, one that had a meeting that had 8 or 9 items on it. That was a very lengthy meeting, and I know our staff worked during the day and they had to be here that night as well. So I would favor something along those lines. I just think it would be get us out earlier, and then perhaps the only downside is, I do recall over the many years I've been on this board, there were people who were had contacted Mr. Evans by phone or email saying that they had another conflict. But I just think that as long as we have a attentive staff with an open listening ear to communicate with these applicants, then they could perhaps be pushed down the agenda if somebody has a hard time getting here if they're the first item up or for a 7 o'clock start.
Mr. Courtney?
Yes, in my case, I have no problem anytime, other than I don't want to meet at 9 o'clock in the morning. But I think the people that are still working should have more say than guys like me, because to me earlier is great, but it doesn't matter. But if somebody works and can't make it from their job here, then I think we have to give them a little more weight. And
I'm fine with the 7.
Support.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Why don't we do it this way? Why don't you put that on as a proposed amendment to the rules of the next meeting, and people can think about it between now and then, and if they have other concerns, we can address it at the next meeting.
Okay.
do it now if you want.
Well, we'll give, Mr. Bartnick's not here, so
Oh,
we'll give him the
might give him
chance
a
to think
chance
about
to-
it. So-
Yes.
Sure.
And Mr. Kalsunis could think about it too if he has any concerns.
Sounds good.
Yes, Ms. Lancaster.
Just a point of business, some of you are aware that Lori Griffin, our boss, every once in a while changes our roles so that all of the city attorneys get to represent the boards. And as of June, Alan Motzke's going to be taking over. I'm going to go to planning. Too bad for you, Mr. Stratt. And I just want to tell you what a pleasure it's been. It's been a great board to work with. You're all very bright and all make a great record. It's been a pleasure working with you. So I'll see you again in a year or so.
Well, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
your service. We appreciate it. We're probably more fun than the planning commission anyway, so. Sorry, Mr. Stratt. Any further, I see there's no one here from the public other than Mr. Kaltsunis, but he's technically an alternate board member, so if there's no public comment and no one else from the board has anything to say, we are adjourned.